During the late 1940s and early 1950s, the African American civil rights movement began to develop. This was the organized struggle by African Americans against racial discrimination and segregation. Ever since the end of Reconstruction in the late 1870s, Southern politicians had been putting laws in place that were meant to deprive African Americans of their political rights. For example, the poll taxes and literacy test were designed to keep African Americans from voting. Um, there, of course, were the segregation laws, or the Jim Crow laws, as they were sometimes called, which required segregation on public transportation, restrooms, water fountains, restaurants, so on and so forth. And of course, there were lynchings, which were still taking place in the South during this time period. In the late 40s, African Americans started to win some of their first victories against Southern segregation. Um, One of the earliest examples is the career of Jackie Robinson, who was accepted onto the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947. He became the first African American to play Major League Baseball and officially broke the so-called color barrier. Now, he was treated very badly by not only players on opposing teams, but even his own teammates were very suspicious of him at first. Really did not know what to think about playing with an African American. But once they started to see just how badly he was treated by whites wherever they went, they started to stick up for him. And that's an interesting story in and of itself. But he paves the way for other African American athletes to come behind him. A year after Jackie Robinson starts his major league career in 1948, President Truman signed an executive order that officially desegregated the armed forces. Believe it or not, from the Civil War, when African Americans were legally allowed to join the armed forces for the first time, up until World War II, the American military had been segregated. It had been organized into units that were all white and units that were all black. And Truman finally ends this by signing this executive order in 1948. And it's 2 years after this, in 1950, when the Korean War breaks out, that African Americans and whites actually fight together in the same units. In 1950, you have the Supreme Court case of Sweatt versus Painter. Herman Sweatt was a student at the University of Texas Law School, and he was not allowed to attend class because he was African American, and Texas law at the time prohibited whites and African Americans from attending classes together. The University of Texas even considered forming a separate law school specifically for African Americans just to keep him out of classes with white students. And in this court case, the Supreme Court ruled that this was an unconstitutional practice. Sweatt was not being afforded the same opportunities as white students, and that the University of Texas would have to desegregate. As far as civil rights goes, Brown versus Board of Education is by far the most important Supreme Court case. This involved an African American girl named Linda Brown, pictured here, and her mother was trying to enroll her in an all-white school in the town of Topeka, Kansas. The school would not allow her to attend, and this case eventually made its way to the Supreme Court. Now, the lawyer who actually argued in favor of Brown was an attorney for the NAACP named Thurgood Marshall. And Thurgood Marshall would later go on to become the first African American appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. But at this point in time, he's just an attorney for the NAACP, and he successfully argues this case in front of the Supreme Court. At this point in time, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is a man named Earl Warren, and he writes the ruling that the Supreme Court eventually comes to. And they rule 9-0 that segregation in public schooling is unconstitutional, and they later declare that desegregation in public schools should be carried out with all deliberate speed. So not only have they declared that these segregation laws are unconstitutional, but they've also declared that schools should begin sending white and African American students to school together as quickly as possible. As it would turn out, many southern school districts would resist this, and all deliberate speed would prove to be very, very slow. There are some school districts in the South that actually did not allow whites and African Americans to go to school together until the 1970s, or in some cases even the 1980s. One of the most famous examples occurred in Little Rock, Arkansas. 9 African Americans were enrolled in Central High School in Little Rock, which had been an all-white school, and the governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, actually sent Arkansas National Guardsmen to surround the school to prevent these African American students from getting inside. It's absolutely amazing how far some of these Southerners were willing to go to keep schools from being integrated. Eventually, President Eisenhower, and by the way, Eisenhower was personally opposed to this. He was from Kansas. He was born in Texas, raised in Kansas. He was actually personally opposed to this, but after all, the Supreme Court had said that schools had to be desegregated, and as president, the head of the executive branch, it was his job to enforce the laws. So President Eisenhower sent troops, the 101st Airborne, to Little Rock to force the school to allow these 9 African American students to attend classes there, and to escort these students to and from class. They literally had to send troops to make sure these students were not beat up as they went to class. This is an actual photograph of one of the so-called Little Rock 9 going to school on the first day at Central High School, and just look at the hate she's getting. It's unbelievable. Now, Governor Faubus, after the first year, actually closed all of the schools in Little Rock. He would rather shut down the schools than allow African American students to continue to go there. The Supreme Court ruled that this was unconstitutional. They had to reopen the schools, but as I said earlier, it's absolutely unbelievable just how far some of these politicians were willing to go to keep these schools from being desegregated. The last thing I want to look at as far as the early stages of the civil rights movement goes is the Montgomery bus boycott. Now, this is usually considered the official beginning of the civil rights movement. So in Montgomery, the public transportation system was segregated. African Americans were required to sit in the rear of city buses. They could not enter through the same door as whites. They had to enter through a rear door. And to protest this, a seamstress named Rosa Parks, a name I'm sure we've all heard of before, decided that she would not give up her seat to a white passenger and was actually arrested for it. This was on December 1st, 1955. Now, it's not clear if this was prearranged or not. She was a member of the local NAACP, and so this could have been a staged event to start a protest. But whatever the case, she was arrested for not giving up her seat. And on the day of her trial, around 40,000 African Americans refused to ride the Montgomery buses. Eventually, it was decided that this boycott would be extended, and they would not, the African American community in Montgomery, Alabama, would not use the city buses until they were officially desegregated. Now, leading this protest was a 26-year-old Baptist preacher by the name of Martin Luther King Jr. This was Martin Luther King's first leadership role in the civil rights movement. He was actually arrested twice during this boycott. His home was bombed during this time period, but the boycott remained ongoing for over a year, 381 days to be exact. And finally, in the summer of 1956, and the Alabama federal court ruled that the segregation of buses in Montgomery was a violation of the 14th Amendment. Now, when we think of the 14th Amendment, we think of citizenship. It gave citizenship to freed African Americans. But it also promises equal treatment and equal protection to all citizens. And the Alabama federal court decided that this was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment.